I hereby want to discuss the three interpretation layers of Martin Scorsese's film Shutter Island. The three interpretation layers follow multiple dimensions. One of these dimensions is from sane to insane. Another of these dimensions is from locked to, or from free to locked. And I want to then use these dimensions in order to somewhat go along with the plot. So in Shutter Island, a US Marshal named Teddy Daniels arrives on an island. This island is kind of hosting a mental hospital, an asylum. This asylum is called Ashcliff. He arrives there with his new partner, Chuck. Now, in the beginning, we think Teddy is a US Marshal and he is sane. In the end, we think he is not a US Marshal and he is insane. Now, in the beginning, the US Marshal, Teddy, seems to be free. At the end, he is kind of very unfree or locked, even then with the second interpretation, which I will then discuss after we first went through the plot. We also have another, basically another dimension. It's not another dimension, but Teddy goes again. If we then assume Teddy is not actually Teddy, but this other person we will discover, then he also does go from somewhat free, from still being a patient, to then being lobotomized, which seems to be a procedure which is not used any longer, in which there is brain surgery, in which certain connections of different parts of the brain are severed. Now, first of all, we want to discuss the plot on the first watch. Now, from a big whole, one could also say, or from a global perspective, one could also say that a movie like this, a movie like Shutter Island, which is kind of a psycho thriller, you could say, maybe should not have interpretation that is obvious. Maybe it should have an interpretation that is obvious on the first watch, but then already lay in the clues for then kind of a revelation, which already happens in the first watch. If you then know this, then you will watch it the second time differently. And this is also part of this thesis which I want to discuss, where there are three main interpretations. And then, as you know, then the second, basically as you watched for evidence for the second thesis or the second interpretation, you then might watch the movie again and again fall into the first, basically back into the first interpretation, but also might notice different things that are not aligned with both interpretations. So there might be a third interpretation, which then might be the actual interpretation. But again, maybe if Martin Scorsese thought about, do I want to have these people watch this movie one time or two times, or maybe they can watch it again and again, and it will be an experience where they discover something infinitely and switch back in between those two interpretations, similarly to how you might decide to go to the gym, but then decide to not go to the gym, but then decide, yeah, well, it actually makes sense to go to the gym, but then decide to not go, and so on and so forth. So switching in between these different interpretations or these different choices. Now, Teddy arrives on the island. Now, he is there to basically search for somebody who is named Solano. Now, Solano is somebody who drowned their children. A woman who drowned supposedly their children, but she's gone. She then arrives a couple of days later, and she's also gone without shoes. But she arrives a couple of days later with her feet somewhat intact, which means that at least that's one interpretation, that she actually wasn't gone on along, and she seems to then be part of something going on behind Teddy Daniels' eyes, basically. Teddy Daniels also seems to be somewhat of a good US Marshal, so he seems to be somewhat intelligent. He also seems to notice lots of different things, and we also notice these things with Teddy Daniels because we assume kind of his perspective. We come along with him on this island, onto this island. He also arrives with his new partner Chuck, which he apparently doesn't know before. There are also multiple pieces of evidence where his partner Chuck seems to not be actually a proper US Marshal, or there are at least a couple of pieces of evidence, such as when they in the beginning hand over their guns, which they seemingly have to do, his partner Chuck actually has kind of trouble getting off his gun, maybe because he does it the first time. At least that's what one of the common interpretations of this might be. Now, they search for Solano. Solano then turns up, and Solano also then thinks Teddy Daniels is actually his husband, or her husband rather. Now, we also find out that Teddy actually is having an additional motive to come to the island. He's searching for Andrew Laddis, and Andrew Laddis is an arsonist who set his house on fire, in which then his wife died. So not the wife of Andrew Laddis, but the wife of Teddy Daniels. Now, throughout basically the process of trying to find evidence for the disappearance of Solando, Teddy is also repeatedly offered cigarettes, first by Chuck and also by other staff, and maybe also offered an aspirin, or also is offered something similar to a headache tablet, which might play into a different interpretation, and also not a different interpretation, which might play into the first interpretation, that actually Teddy Daniels is who he says he is, and the hospital staff seems to be in on some plot in order to, I don't know, make him maybe not sane, or make him go from sane to insane. So maybe they are trying to hide something from either the US Marshal, but also maybe from what the US Marshal represents. Maybe it is the US government. So I now want to draw up 3 different entities that are kind of our main entities. There is also additionally Chuck, who acts also. But first of all, we now have Teddy Daniels, represented as T. We then also have the Asylum, represented with A, and then we also have a possible third entity, which we call G for US government. Now, the interpretations shift. The interpretations shift as basically Teddy Daniels, so he cannot leave the island because there is a storm. And there is also this metaphor of water being the thing, or water is also something that maybe it just occurs again and again, and there might be different interpretations of what that water actually means, but he cannot leave the island because there is a storm. Also, we have to know that Dr. Sheehan, a previous doctor who is involved in the case, has actually disappeared, and it then turns out in the ending of the movie that, so he suspects different things. He also meets, as he is severed from his partner Chuck once, he's also climbing down a cliff where he meets somebody else who is also somewhat Solando, and who also looks kind of like the woman who is Solando. And she tells Teddy Daniels that she is a psychiatrist who used to work here, and they are trying to do some kind of mind control. And they will use probably trauma from his past, maybe from his wife being burned in this fire, to maybe make him go from sane to insane. Now, in the end, he actually then tries to search for Chuck, his partner, because he thinks he might go into this lighthouse, which we already kind of know that there might be brain surgery. This is also, I think, from the Solando he meets kind of in this cave. But in the lighthouse then, he meets the head of the asylum, who tells him then he is actually Teddy Daniels. And he's not Teddy Daniels, but he's Andrew Laddis. And both are an anagram, so they use the same letters, and then you can come up with both names. And also, Teddy referred to this, so this might be quite a coincidence, but also, well, would maybe his subconscious mind make up something like this? Or might his subconscious mind make up also his partner Chuck, because his partner Chuck actually disappeared? So the question then is on the secondary watch. So first of all, they tell him basically that he is insane, and this was an elaborate plot to make him go from insane to sane. And he seems to have, at least according to the staff, who is also now including his partner Chuck, which is Dr. Sheehan, who is Dr. Sheehan. And the hospital staff tells Teddy that he was in the state that he already kind of realized and recalled these other things already a couple of months earlier. And so then he is kind of sitting in the yard of this asylum, and he is talking with Chuck again, and he refers to him as Chuck. And so then Andrew says to Sheehan that they must leave the island, and then Sheehan signals to Cawley, who is the head of the island, that Andrew needs to be lobotomized. At least that's what the Wikipedia article says. In the movie, you actually just see a couple of waves, and then somebody has something which appears to be an anesthesia, basically an injection with an anesthesia which the worker is kind of holding, and then Andrew is going with them, or Teddy is going with them. So now we have these three entities. The question is which of these entities is who they say they are, and which of these entities does have a different additional motive. That this motive might be dark, so this additional entity could then be seen as the antagonist. First of all, this is not existing. So we have T, Teddy, and we have A, the asylum. The question is not so much whether the asylum is insane, but whether Teddy is sane or insane. And Teddy also then goes from free to locked, at least as we think. But then, actually, after you then find out that this was all an elaborate plot, at least according to the asylum, the question then becomes who is actually the good one here. Because Teddy then is Andrew Ladis, and Andrew Ladis is the person who then killed his wife after his wife killed their children. Now, also, we have now the asylum. So, in the first view, and this is now the overarching theme, the three interpretations again. In the first interpretation, we have Teddy, who is a US Marshal, and we have the asylum, who are doing some mind control things, probably, and who might turn, or want to turn, the US Marshal insane, because then he cannot leave the asylum, or cannot leave Ashcliff or the island, and tell other people about this and potentially stop these experiments. Now, Corley, who is the head of the asylum, actually also tells Teddy Daniels that they used to do different methods, such as lobotomizing people, which is severing brain connections in order to possibly improve symptoms of different symptoms of psychiatric disorders. And so this was now basically a plot designed just for Teddy Daniels. So kind of to prove maybe, or to testify, not to testify, but to test whether you could actually turn somebody who is insane to somebody who is sane by just making up this plot and acting out this thing in real life and then telling him that this wasn't real. This basically moves. So the question of who is the evil party, maybe I have like this evil tape here, and the question who is evil, first of all, in the first watch is Asylum. The Asylum is the evil party. And then throughout, basically, or in the end at least, this evil thing moves from here to Teddy, because Teddy is now actually a murderer. And the Asylum are actually the good people, because they don't want to lobotomize him, and they are trying to basically bring psychiatry forward into a new level where they treat patients respectfully and with also drugs instead of lobotomizing them, so basically operating on them or just locking people like this away. Then we have the third watch, in which the view might switch again. The third watch might not now already be the third interpretation layer, but during the third, so there might only be a certain overlap through. So of course, maybe the movie is designed to be rewatched 2 times, so then we would have 3 watches in total, and each time the interpretation basically flips. So first of all, Teddy is the good one, then Teddy is the bad one, and then maybe Teddy is indeed the good one again. And actually recently I saw a YouTube video where he explained basically the first interpretation, that Teddy is indeed the good one and that the Asylum is indeed the bad one, which is the obvious interpretation, but also I realized it is not the obvious interpretation because it's a third interpretation. It's only after the first watching of the movie that the second interpretation, that Teddy is actually the evil one, is the kind of obvious one that at least the movie after the first watch kind of wants you to believe. Now, there is also an additional question, and the additional question is if there is any other party involved, possibly with this. And the other party involved is somewhat obvious, and it also is already somewhat existing. This other party is the US government. The US government is selecting Teddy Daniels probably to send him to the island, either by making him, by basically selecting him as a US Marshal who should find out about Solano, and then during this thing, he then basically, we have these 2 interpretations which flip back and forth. So either the US government is now sending Teddy as a US Marshal, so in this case we would have the Asylum as the bad one, or the US government sends Teddy Daniels because he was in front of a jury and then actually was sentenced by going to the Asylum, which now might not be the bad one, but none of these people might be the bad one. Of course, no, this is not true. Teddy then actually is the bad one because he is a murderer. So then the Asylum is again the good people. They are again the good people. Now, we also have other possible interpretations where the government actually does not send either the US Marshal for the sake of finding out what is going on the island. Or so these are only the two scenarios. These two, Teddy can only flip between being Andrew Laeddis and being a US Marshal, aka Teddy Daniels. Nonetheless, the motives of the third party, the government, might be different motives, but still Teddy Daniels is sent to the island either as Teddy Daniels or Andrew Laeddis by mostly the US government. So we have this third entity either way, because someone needs to send Teddy there. Either this was a long time ago, maybe 2 years ago, according to, I think, at least, I don't know if it's in the Wikipedia article, but I think it is 2 years ago or something like this that he was sent to this. But this could be also not provided. So this fact, or 2 years, could be random now. I don't know if there is any proof in the movie or, yeah, in the movie about this. So the question is, when does Teddy arrive to the island? And this also, I actually saw a comment on YouTube where somebody said, if we would see just 1 minute before the movie begins and 1 minute after the movie begins, we would actually have kind of, we would kind of know what is going on. Also, what is going on in a possible third interpretation. Now, the third interpretation and the third entity and the third, basically the third watch, are kind of overlapping at this point. Because there might be different incentives the government would have in sending Teddy as Andrew Laeddis or as US Marshal to the island. If they sent Teddy as a patient to the island, then they might want to just send him. Basically, they would maybe not have an additional motive. They would just sentence him going to the island, basically, in order to try to improve his condition. But additionally, they might also try to now observe what is happening between those. Now, in the movie, we don't really have observers. So there are prison guards. We have also the asylum people, and the asylum people and the prison guards seem to be overlapped. In the beginning, as Chuck and Teddy arrive, there is actually kind of a range of guards, and also the guards are driving around Teddy and also other people. But the question is obviously, so if the government actually wanted to have people on the island, so the question is, if the government wanted to test if the government wanted to test either Teddy or the asylum or both, they would have to have somebody on the island who is not Teddy or who is not the asylum people, depending now on what the government wants to test and also what the motives and what the identities of these two actually are. Whether these are actually good people or bad people, or Teddy is Andrew Laeddis, aka a bad person, a murderer, or actually a good US Marshal who is just trying to find out, but might also have been selected, maybe also by the US government. So maybe the US government said, okay, who wants to go to the island? That is one opportunity, or that is one scenario. And then Teddy said, okay, I want to go to this island because on this island there might be this person called Andrew Laeddis who might have basically killed indirectly Teddy's wife. So this might be on basically somewhat instructed by the government, because maybe they already kind of just gave him this offer, similarly to how in Ex Machina, Caleb seems to have won this lottery in which he can go to the island, but we don't see any other participants, and the movie already then starts him flying to the island. I actually already made a second video, or basically a video where I wanted to compare the plot points or the interpretation layers and the similarities between those of Shutter Island and Ex Machina, but I stored it on my hard drive, so the couple of first seconds are not on the video. So I am making this video again now as a first part with Shutter Island, then possibly a second part with Ex Machina, and then a third part where I compare the similarities. Now, now the third interpretation layer has multiple sub-variants or multiple variants, and it depends on all of these factors. So we have the flipping factor Teddy, Andrew, good, bad, and also what the government actually wants. What could the government want? The government could want to test the asylum. But it might have known, similar to Teddy, that there are experiments going on the island. So it might be, for example, a person who sits in the Senate, and he or she finds out that there might be some things going on. So he or she uses this as a kind of thing to, as a pretense is the word. Maybe the senator uses this as a pretense to find out more about either the government or about this asylum, which might be sponsored by the government or might not be sponsored by the government. So the question is what the government knows and what it doesn't know. Either way, somehow Teddy, as a US Marshal, is sent to this asylum and then either is made sane or stays sane and then is lobotomized, or is made insane, kind of, and then is also basically lobotomized. It doesn't really matter at this point in time. From the first and the third interpretation, or from I think I watched the movie 2 times, but I mostly think that the movie presents evidence, mostly that it seems to me that the evidence overweighs that the asylum people are actually the bad people. So the question is then, what would have the third entity, what interests it would have. So let's say, okay, this is also subdivided. There might be the bad government who is experimenting on people in order to make good soldiers, for example, who don't have any negative associations and who can just execute orders. And therefore they created this asylum, and now somebody finds out about this, but also because the government kind of controls itself in these multiple chambers, then somebody finds out and sends Teddy as US Marshal to the island. Now, the government might also send, in the same scenario, Teddy as patient, as Androdatus, to the island in order to then kind of find out. For the government, but to find out then, the government would actually have to have spies on the island. This could either be people in the asylum, or this could be also the prison guards. I don't know if there is any visual evidence for this, or if there are any scenes for this. So this third interpretation layer is mostly now based on what would also kind of be possible and would also somewhat make sense. But I would have, I think, to rewatch the movie another time to find evidence for this further interpretation layer. And also the movie cuts just before they arrive to the island and basically in the end. So it could be, for example, that it is then that these people from the government are on the island and that they just interrupt this experiment because they now know, and this could be something else they wanted to find out, whether a US Marshal could be made insane by the asylum. So this could be one of the theses, I don't know what the plural of thesis is, that they want to test now either in good spirit or in bad spirit whether a US Marshal, even a US Marshal that has gone through these multiple selection criteria when becoming a US Marshal, can be made insane by people at the asylum. So this maybe as a kind of proof of a thesis that you can kind of bend people's minds into, or make them seem sane or insane. Now, they could also have sent Teddy basically to the island in order to just test the asylum, and without making Teddy know anything, but they actually wanted just to test the asylum. This could also have been the case. So either they wanted to just test Teddy, could also have been the case that this was just the final test of Teddy becoming a US Marshal and maybe getting a higher position. Is there any evidence for this? I don't know. Then we could have the government just testing the asylum, but the government could be either now just a representative or a subcategory of the government testing another part of the government who is actually or has already set up the asylum in one way or another. So there are these multiple different interpretations. It depends on these different variables, and if we have a variable that is here, a subcategory, and here a subcategory, and this could basically on and off, and this could be on and off, being evil or not evil, being evil or not evil, then we have just these multiple different interpretations, because of course we have all combinations of these variables with on and off and good and evil, basically. There is also something else. This something else is that this whole thing is kind of very similar to an experiment that was conducted, which is called the Rosenhan experiment. Now, there is also some critique where people say this experiment might actually not have been conducted. Now, the Rosenhan experiment, so this is also in the Wikipedia article, and there was also a paper published on this, and there might be, basically this experiment also might have been a little bit like fraud. So, the Rosenhan experiment was divided into 2 parts, and these 2 parts were, first of all, that people who pretended to be healthy, people who were actually healthy, they pretended to have somewhat of a psychosis, and then they applied basically at different hospitals, and some of them, basically all of them, in the end, I think it will make more sense to just read from the Wikipedia article. So, the pseudo-patient experiment. The experiment is divided into 2 parts, and now I will read the first part. The first part involved the use of healthy associates or pseudo-patients, 3 women and 6 men, so this would be 9 in total, including Rosenhan himself, who briefly feigned auditory hallucinations in an attempt to gain admission to 12 psychiatric hospitals in 5 United in 5 states in the United States. All were admitted and diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. After admission now, the pseudopatients acted normally and told staff that they no longer experienced any additional hallucinations. So they pretended to be insane, but then said, okay, I am actually sane now, but after only they were admitted to the hospital. As a condition of their release, all of the patients were forced to admit to having a mental illness, similarly to how Andrew Ladis, or Teddy Daniels, is also forced to admit that he actually is psychotic, or that he actually is Andrew Ladis, and because otherwise he might not be able to stay at the asylum, or he is able to stay at the asylum as now sane or insane. It doesn't really matter because he cannot get off the island. For him, it doesn't really matter, it seems. But then, as he refers to Chuck again as Chuck and says they need to leave the island, there is also the question, if Teddy Daniels is actually a US Marshal, then this is kind of a flip. This is kind of a switch. It now either can show that Teddy is actually a patient, and he then refers to Chuck again as Chuck, because, well, or he was actually, so the question is, what Teddy Daniels then is. Was he Teddy Daniels? And he does not just think he's Andrew Ladis, but he now kind of accepted this, and he just says or mentions to him again Chuck, because he kind of doesn't know any longer what is real or not real, so he just uses this name Chuck. So if he is the US Marshal, Teddy Daniels, then he now seems to be so confused that he refers to him as Chuck. The second interpretation is that he actually is then Andrew Ladis, and Andrew Ladis would now refer to his partner as Chuck, because he just forgot, what did he actually forget? Because he now knows that Chuck is Dr. Sheehan. So why would he? Because maybe he fell back, similarly to how basically the staff of the asylum also told him that he also relapsed a couple of months ago. But well, these are the two interpretations in this case. Then, in terms of the Rosenhan experiment, we also now have a second part. The second part of the study involved a hospital administration challenging Rosenhan to send pseudopatients to its facility, whose staff asserted that they would be able to detect the pseudopatients. Now, this is again now the kind of the switch, which I will discuss shortly. Rosenhan agreed, and the following weeks, 41 out of 193 new patients were identified as potential pseudopatients, with 19 of these receiving suspicion from at least one psychiatrist and one other staff member. Rosenhan then revealed that he sent no pseudopatients to the hospital. Now, pseudopatient or not pseudopatient, in either case, the two flipping interpretations of Shutter Island are that Teddy Daniels is now either a pseudopatient, so he's actually Andrew Daniels, US Marshal, so he is now part 1. Part 1 is actually now overlapping with part 1 of the Rosenhan experiment, where he is not psychiatric, he is basically sane. But the hospital thinks, or then also tries to make him insane, similar to in the Rosenhan experiment. They also then say, okay, we actually diagnosed you, and if you now want to leave, you have to admit that you are insane, similarly to in the Lighthouse, or in the scenes after the Lighthouse. He then has to admit that he's actually Andrew Ladis, and he actually has to admit that this is basically the truth the hospital staff told him is the actual truth, and he's not Teddy Daniels any longer. But then the second part of the Rosenhan experiment, in which he is now similarly to how you would watch then the movie again, and you would now assume, similarly to how you follow the Rosenhan experiment while reading this, the second part is now that he is in the beginning insane. But then maybe in the end, so your perspective of viewing Teddy Daniels is, in the first watch, is that he is sane, but he goes to insane. So your perception of Teddy Daniels changes, as well as his perception changes. Then when you watch the movie the second time, you now know that he's kind of insane. At least that's maybe your baseline assumption. At least that's maybe what Martin Scorsese wanted you to think when rewatching the movie the first time. And then you go basically from insane to sane. Because after the second movie, you might not only find clues for the elaborate plot of the hospital, but you also, similarly to how in the first part, you might have realized that there might be something going on with the hospital, not the hospital, but the asylum staff, that they might have somewhat of an evil plot in order to make him actually insane. Similarly to how you then think okay, Teddy Daniels is actually Androladis and he is insane after when rewatching the first time, then you see also other things that are basically evidence for, okay, he actually might also be an US Marshal again, similarly to how you in the beginning of the first movie thought he was actually sane and a US Marshal. Then in the third watch, there might now be these different interpretations. You now basically know both interpretations. You also know that you, as well as Teddy Daniels, went from sane to insane and from insane to sane in the first rewatch of the movie again, and now you, while watching the movie the third time, you might have these conflicting things, this conflicting evidence, where you flip basically back and forth, and you might also suspect maybe that there's a third entity, which might be G, the government. Now, what the role of G, the government is unclear, but maybe the government is now kind of just the observer. Similarly to how in the Rosenhan experiment, there is also an observer that is actually planning the whole thing all along, and this observer in this case is David Rosenhan, who made the experiment. Now, what the question, of course, now is also similar to, now this might be a little bit of a far-fetched, I think, but similarly to how there is also a critique on the Rosenhan experiment that it was actually fake, there might also be, now, the question might also be, what is actually, now, I actually forgot what I wanted to say with the third thing and the government. What I wanted to say is that the government also, so in case of the Rosenhan experiment, the third entity, aka Rosenhan, had also an agenda. He wanted seemingly to basically bring psychiatry, or to show kind of what the level of psychiatry currently is, but it then also might turn out, at least in when reading the Wikipedia article, that there is this criticism that Rosenhan actually was not who he said he is, or that's now just a very simplified version, that he actually might have faked some quotes from the hospital and so on. Many respondents to the publication defended psychiatry, saying that as psychiatric diagnosis relies largely on the patient's report of no, this is not the thing. Accusation of fraud. In The Great Pretender, 2019 book on Rosenhan, author Susan Callahan questions the veracity and validity of the Rosenhan experiment. Examining documents left behind by Rosenhan after his death, Callahan finds apparent distortion in the Science article, inconsistent data, misleading descriptions, and inaccurate or fabricated quotations from psychiatric records. So the question also for Shutter Island is then whether what the US government actually told Androladis or the other party. We already have these switching interpretations. Either they sent him as a patient, or they sent him as a US Marshal, so a pseudo-patient. But the question is also whether they might want to test the asylum, which they also kind of do, similarly to Rosenhan, who is actually testing the asylum with patients who actually know about this. But this is now an additional level, maybe, because Teddy Daniels doesn't know about the whole thing. Maybe he knows a little bit about the whole thing, but maybe, similarly to how I already discussed, there might be an offering who of all the US Marshals wants to go to this case, and maybe Teddy Daniels had an overlap of interest, so this might be one interpretation. Maybe Teddy Daniels is somewhat in on this whole thing, but nonetheless turns from sane to insane. So he might be in on this whole thing of testing the asylum, but this is kind of an overlap anyway, because he tests the asylum anyway, so there might be just something additional the government might want to test, but they don't tell Teddy Daniels. And so there are these three interpretation layers. The first, and also overlapping with basically the Rosenhan experiment and the three different parts of the Rosenhan experiment. First of all, the pseudo-patients. Second of all, the real patients, which are actually not real patients, or they haven't even been sent because they didn't need to be sent, similarly to how Teddy actually might not have to be sent. The only thing that the government might have to do is to have basically eyes on the island in form of maybe somebody who is on the island and who observes the other people who are acting then and making up maybe this elaborate plot. And the third interpretation would then be that we also include this third entity, or we switch back and forth, but we also might switch back and forth because of this third entity and because of the multiple different interpretations of, okay, who is the bad part? Is it this here, or is it also the government who maybe set up the hospital, or maybe also set up Teddy Daniels or Androladis for basically multiple revelations and did tell either this party or this party not about the whole thing.